now like to introduce Jade Norris. She's from the RSPCA Australia, and she's been putting together all the information from the task force of working on puppy mills. Thank you.
Thanks, Joy. Hi, everyone. I'm going to be talking about puppy farms and the associated legislation, but I just thought I'd start off by showing a quick video. It's essentially raw footage that RSPCA inspectors took at a puppy farm in New South Wales, and then the second puppy farm is in Queensland. Just want to warn you, some of the footage might be a little bit disturbing, so might roll the tape. Thanks.
16 a.m. We're just entering the puppy room, the southern end of the building. The smell of ammonia is really overwhelming. No water in for these dogs. Yeah, it's spinning. Yeah. Okay, 5-9.
They've got some bad skin problems, as you can probably see. They've got one there with a border patch. Yeah. Right, if you pan over this dog here, she's got ringworm like you wouldn't believe. See that one there? Thanks. And slop to eat. One over here is fleeing, but a sweetheart. She wants to talk to you, but she's so distracted by the fleas. See what she's doing? They're attacking her badly.
This is a puppy farm in Queensland. There's no audio, so just might talk a bit. And a lot of the dogs were actually emaciated once they were groomed. They sort of had never been groomed, and underneath all of that hair and stuff, they were basically starving. So, okay, so I'm going to talk about legislative progress in terms of ending puppy farms since 2009. Just to give you a bit of background, the RSPCA has been running a major campaign to end puppy farming since the end of 2009. But prior to that, our inspectorates were actually involved in rescuing dogs from situations like the one in the video. So I'm just going to run through the progress since 2009. And I might just start off by defining what a puppy farm actually is. And from the RSPCA's perspective, we define a puppy farm, which might also be termed a puppy factory or a puppy mill. We define it as an intensive dog breeding facility that is operated under inadequate conditions that fail to meet the animal's needs. And those needs might be include social, behavioural and physiological needs. We also make the point that usually these facilities are large-scale and commercial, but it's important to remember that inadequate conditions can occur at any scale of operation. So I guess one might ask the question, how is it possible that places like these shown in the video can exist in Australia? And one of the main reasons is that the regulations for the breeding and the sale of dogs are really inadequate. And what we did at the National Office was we actually made up some tables looking at the regulations that exist. And these are pretty detailed, so I won't go into any detail, but essentially wherever you see the orange, sort of coming up as murky orange there, is where there's a regulatory gap. And unfortunately, the gaps really predominate. So as an example, let's see here, that's regulation for breeding, but... Oh, right, okay, thanks. I've actually shown an example for the next slide. So that's gaps in the regulation of breeding across the state. So in each column, we've got each state, and we've got some questions down the side there. I was going to use the example of the second one up from the bottom is, are businesses that breed dogs for sale required to be licensed or registered? And as you can see, there are only a few states and territories actually have that requirement. And again, this is looking at a snapshot of the regulations for the sale of dogs. And again, as you can see, major gaps nationally across Australia. And just continued. So it's asking questions like, do the pups need to be microchipped before they're sold or transferred? And it's asking questions like, do pet shops have a code of practice, for example? So in terms of what progress has been made, there has been some progress, but overall, our opinion is that a lot more work does need to be done, and certainly in relation to the coordination of efforts nationally. Because as has been mentioned previously, dogs can be bred in one state and then they can be transferred across the state border and sold to unsuspecting puppy buyers. And they could have come from a puppy farm, but the buyer has no idea. So in terms of what the good news is, I'm just going to run through each state really quickly. In Tasmania, AWAC, which stands for the Animal Welfare Advisory Committee, they've actually committed to developing a code of practice for breeding dogs. So at the moment in Tasmania, there are no standards for dog breeding. So it's really good that AWAC has taken that on, and they're going to be developing those standards over the next, I understand it's to be the next 12 months. They've also introduced mandatory microchipping in Tasmania. Now, as you can see from the slide, that's from 6 months of age. But I guess the positive thing to take from that is that once you get microchipping framework in place, and once people get used to the idea of dogs, needing to be microchipped, what we can then hopefully do is reduce the age that dogs need to be microchipped. So actually have a legal requirement that pups are microchipped by the breeder prior to sale or transfer to allow for that really critical breeder traceability aspect, so that from each individual pup, you can actually trace back to the person who bred that dog. And once you have breeder traceability, then you have breeder accountability. And that's certainly lacking at the moment. So in Victoria, quite a lot of things have happened, quite a lot of positive steps. What they first of all did was they reviewed their Domestic Animals Act, and RSPCA Victoria had input into that public consultation phase. What they've also done is they've increased powers to the RSPCA Inspectorate so that we can actually act under the Domestic Animals Act as opposed to just the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act. So previously, our RSPCA inspectors were quite constrained in that we could only act under POCTA, but now we can actually go in under the Domestic Animals Act and help more animals, essentially. So those are really good, positive steps. In South Australia, a few things have happened. They have reviewed their pet trade code of practice. So the pet trade code of practice covers animals that are being sold like through pet shops, for example. We also provided input into that consultation phase, and we're just awaiting the South Australian government to release that reviewed code of practice. Northern Territory. The Northern Territory is interesting because they don't actually have a territory-wide Domestic Animals Act. What they have is local bylaws. The only significant things that have happened in the Northern Territory is that more councils have made microchipping compulsory in their local council areas. So, I mean, I guess that's something. It's not incredibly significant, but if we can just increase the rates of microchipping and then get microchipping frameworks in place, then essentially get the dogs microchipped by the breeder, then I guess we're getting somewhere. So Queensland, we've talked a bit already today about systems in place in Queensland. Basically, the Queensland government announced that they would introduce a breeder ID system, and that would involve breeders displaying their ID numbers in any advertisements whenever they sell a puppy, and also provide their breeder ID number whenever they sell or transfer a puppy. And we think that's a really good system. They're still developing it. It's not actually in place right now, but we certainly support the idea of having a breeder ID number in an ad. And I think, Joy, we already talked about the Gold Coast breeder permit system, so I won't go into that. So in the ACT, again, Michael Linke has already spoken about what's happening in the ACT. Essentially, no regulatory changes, but a discussion paper has been released, and we're awaiting release by the ACT government. Essentially, things are happening. There are some waves occurring. People are talking about the issue. We don't really have anything concrete at this stage, but I guess people talking about the issue is the beginning. Okay, so New South Wales. New South Wales actually has 2 animal welfare codes of practice, one for pet shops and another one for breeding dogs and cats. And those codes of practice contain enforceable standards, which is what we like to see, rather than guidelines. So those codes of practice themselves are good, but the issue is that a lot of these puppy farmers are operating under the radar, and without a central registry of breeders, we just don't know where they are. And if we don't know where they are, we can't check what the standards are in those breeding facilities. So certainly having a breeder registration system where they're at least identified so that we know where they are would certainly help. And also having the microchips of the pups linked to those breeders and those breeder ID numbers. Okay, almost there. So this is a bit of dry material, so we're almost through all the states. So in Western Australia, again, no significant changes. They do actually have a kennel licensing system in Western Australia, but they don't have any standards for breeding dogs, and they also don't have compulsory microchipping. So while you have to get a kennel license, you can set up a kennel and you can breed dogs, but once you sell them, you're effectively not traceable from the puppies that you're breeding. So WA would certainly benefit from having a situation where for every pup someone with a kennel licence breeds, the breeder can be traced back from that pup. And the microchip is the best way to do that. Now, I just wanted to mention quickly that the ANKC has also introduced compulsory microchipping, so they won't register a pup from 1st of Jan 2012 unless it's been microchipped first. And just overall, that's really helpful with our microchipping push. So, yeah, we applaud the ANKC for doing that. And we hope that it will just generally help the drive to microchip dogs generally. So the key points I wanted to make today was essentially that the regulations for the breeding and also the sale of dogs are inadequate. And that's one of the main reasons why puppy farms are existing in Australia. It's not the only reason, but it's one of the critical factors. And, as everyone else has mentioned, we need greater resources for monitoring dog breeders and also enforcing the regulations that we do have. And one such enforcement model that could work is a co-regulatory approach, whereby you have local government officers working with animal welfare inspectors. And I know that already happens in a lot of situations. Certainly with the Queensland breeder ID scheme, it sounds like you'd have local government officers working with animal welfare officers, and that may be the ideal approach. So another key point I wanted to make is this inconsistency across the states and territories of Australia, and that is a complicating factor. Every state and territory seems to be at a different level, and so it would be very beneficial to actually get all the states and territories up to the same level and have some consistency across the states. But it's not only inconsistency, we also need coordination because we know there are cases, and Michael Linky mentioned this earlier, where pups will be bred in a puppy farm in New South Wales, and then they'll be sent across the border into the ACT and they'll be sold in the ACT. And effectively that breeder is not accountable at all. So we need to coordinate our state and territory efforts so that when puppies cross borders, we can still trace back to the breeder who might be on the other side of Australia. And we know, as an example, that people are selling pups over the internet, and they might be based in New South Wales, but that someone buys the puppies in Perth, and the pups are actually flown from somewhere in New South Wales to a family in Perth who's bought the pup over the internet. They have no idea that the breeding bitch might be kept in a horrible condition in cages for years on end. So we really need to open up dog breeding, make it more transparent, and make the industry generally more accountable. What else have I got there? Right, one of the main points we also make is this compulsory microchipping by the breeder prior to sale or transfer, and hopefully with a nationally coordinated microchip database. So when you look at the microchipping laws, a lot of them are sort of the dog must be microchipped from 6 months of age, and it doesn't capture that breeding aspect. So we want to capture that, and we think microchipping by the breeder will help to do that. Another main component of this campaign is to get breeder IDs, with the outcome of being able to trace the breeder from the pup and having the breeders identified on a central registry. So that's one of the other main things that we promote. And again, state-based initiatives are essential. We need to get all the states up to the same level, but then we need to coordinate with each other so we can make sure these people don't get away with transferring pups across borders and not being accountable. One of the last points I want to make is just about export. We know that puppy farms in Australia will export their pups overseas, and that it is actually quite a lucrative market. And at the moment, the export requirements are pretty insufficient, and certainly the importing country sets the requirements. And usually those requirements are health-based, so have the dogs received a rabies vaccination, or are they rabies clear, for example. We think one of the best strategies to address puppy farmers selling pups overseas is to raise the age of pups going. So if we were to make it a legal requirement that pups going who aren't accompanied by an owner to, let's say, 6 months, that would effectively cut off that market because they're then beyond the fluffy, cute puppy stage. So that would be one strategy, and we're looking into that. And, there are issues with, where have the dogs come from when they're being exported? Are they microchipped? Do we know who the breeder is? Do we know who the exporter is? And, of course, what sort of conditions are the animals going to as well? So while I'm talking about legislation and the fact that there are huge regulatory gaps that need to be addressed across Australia, this is a pretty complex problem, and we need a holistic approach. So we need regulatory reform, but we have to combine that with public awareness so that we have prospective puppy buyers expecting a breeder ID number, expecting the pups to be microchipped, expecting that they know the pup hasn't come from a puppy farm, and they can have assurances of that. So as part of our public awareness approach, we developed our Smart Puppy Buyers Guide. I've actually got a bunch here if anyone wants to grab one. But basically it's just a checklist for members of the public to use to help them find a responsible breeder. And obviously our first message is always, look, if you're looking for a puppy or a dog, go to your local RSPCA shelter or another reputable rescue group. But if you can't find the pup you're looking for, and often people have a very specific thing in mind. They might want an 8-week-old Dachshund, for example, or an 8-week-old Spoodle, and there doesn't happen to be one in the local shelter. So in that context, we say to people, it's absolutely critical that you visit the breeder at the breeding facility, check out the conditions for yourself, and meet the breeder and make sure the parents are well looked after and so forth. So that's our main message to people. And we've been promoting our guide pretty heavily. I mean, we handed them out at our Million Paws Walk, and also, we sent bunches out to, I think it was like 500 vet clinics across Australia, and about 1,000 dog kennels.